In this in-depth book summary of End of Faith by Sam Harris, I will go over all of his main points, simply presenting what the author says, not providing any of my personal opinion for or against the statements. The way this channel works is that the book summary comes straight from the book, and we will do fact checks or critiques of these points in separate videos. I do this because I want you to get the truest summary of the author's point of view, and so at the end of this video, you will know each of the points made by the author. If you want to purchase this book, check out the link in the description. And if you disagree with something, always assume that I might be wrong first, and look into what the author says. I take notes throughout my reading or listening of the book, and so now let's just jump right in and work our way through this book. In the intro, he takes us through the day in a life of a suicide bomber, who takes out innocent civilians, including children, and that when news breaks of what happened, it shows that his community back home, including his mother, are celebrating this as some sort of noble act. And while dozens of innocent families are weeping, the terrorist's family is weeping tears of joy, knowing that he will be rewarded in the afterlife. He says that hearing this story, you can't tell anything about his background, whether he was rich or poor, college trained up to a PhD, or a high school dropout, exposed to Western culture in big cities, or who spent his whole life in some rural parts of the world, but you would be right to assume that he was Muslim. His point here is that with all of the terrorist attacks that have occurred, they don't really have anything in common in their background, ranging from good and bad upbringings, rich and poor, from families with plenty of opportunities, and others from countries that have legitimate grievances. But the one thing that binds them all is the Islamic faith. He goes out of his way to explain that there are billions of Muslims, and nearly all of them are perfectly peaceful, westernized individuals, and nothing in this book is a call against Muslims, but a call against Islam, along with Christianity and every other form of religious faith. And later in the book he will prove how any religious thinking is dangerous, but at our current point in time, the most violence is coming from Islamic extremists. To show the levels that religion has taken hold in America, he points out some troubling Pew stats. 35% of Americans think that the Bible is literal, 48% think that it's symbolic in some parts, and only 17% have doubts that a personal God wrote the Bible. 46% believe in literal creation, while 40% think that God guides creation. Addressing those that take the Bible literally, he says that that means there are 120 million people in America that are so out of touch with reality that they would have to put the Big Bang 2,500 years after the Sumerians learned how to brew beer. He says the moderation that we find in religion isn't a result of religions fixing themselves, but evolves from secular ideas and economics, as societies that rip themselves apart calling everyone heretics doesn't make for a great place to invest or start a business if you can just call the banker evil and kill him. It also helps that most people don't actually read their religious texts. Again, he isn't isolating Islam, and he's trying to show that there are ridiculously violent things in the Bible as well, when he says that Deuteronomy is specific in killing those that even suggest that you turn away from Yahweh. Even your kids should be killed if they were to try and pull somebody away from Yahweh, and nobody thinks that this can just be symbolic. Deuteronomy 13 verse 1 specifically makes non-literal interpretations look impossible, saying you shall keep my commandments, adding nothing to it, taking nothing away. Moderation is forced not from within, but from the hammer blows of modernity, and most importantly the concept that we need to provide evidence. We have become less tribally isolated, and things like astrophysics and medicine start to make biblical claims seem silly. We don't believe in curses, and almost everyone takes part in the benefits of a society of knowledge and inventions that are based on evidence and scientific methods. So at least tacitly, when a religious person goes to a doctor, they are admitting we do that part better than the ancient ways. But it's ethics that still seems rooted to religion. This is because the science of the mind and our capacity for religious experience is the most complicated phenomena to explain. Those hammers of modernity have banged out germ theory and the knowledge of the atom, but have not yet formed a theory of consciousness and morality that is easily understood by the masses, or produced some tech that people use in their everyday life, so we don't even have that tacit agreement situation like we do with medicine. Once that could happen, religious texts would be to ethics exactly what they are to astrophysics. Moderation is the product of secular knowledge and textual ignorance. And to literalists, these people are equally sinning, while the moderates insult both faith and reason. The moderates also make it more difficult to critique the literalists. They call for keeping these Iron Age ideas on things like morality, spirit, and afterlife, and just ignore the stuff that is disapproved by science and maladaptive for society. We are left with two choices: that we got the ethics right in religious texts from millennia ago, when we had no understanding of any other part of reality, or it is simply that people are stuck in dogma. It is a sort of God of the gaps point that people are able to keep religious-based ethics because explaining anything related to the mind and consciousness is less obviously objective than explaining the layers of dirt that show that the Earth isn't 6,000 years old. We are put in a predicament where, because it is obvious that the only reason why we don't believe in some parts is because of science, progress might eventually destroy the reliance on these religious texts, and therefore one who has chosen to be literal must choose to fight society and progress itself. To help make this point, he creates a thought experiment where he says, imagine if tomorrow we didn't know how to do or use anything. We would first want to learn language, how to get food, how to build shelter, and stop disease. But why would we care about Jesus being born of a virgin, that adulterers should be stoned? But also, how would we pick the Bible over the Quran, or any Hindu, Greek, Egyptian, or Norse mythology? The modern religious texts just seem important today because they were considered important yesterday. He says right now we are currently running a giant psych experiment that has resulted in millions of deaths. Give people divergent, irreconcilable, and untestable concepts of God, and then make them live together with limited resources. This proves how we are all at our worst when we don't ask for evidence. Throw in nukes, and that's the recipe to end the world. India and Pakistan are two countries with a history of religious violence, and who have access to nuclear weapons. And to make this not seem like some abstract philosophical musing, he talks about the winter of 2002, when Hindus and Muslims carried out violent attacks on each other, with stories about women being raped, burnt alive, ripping out fetuses, and throwing them on the fire. A type of hellscape that you would think was from the medieval times happened in this century, just 2 years before this book was released. He reiterates that the upcoming point is not about Muslim people, but about the core tenets in the faith of Islam, and he dislikes the term saying that we are fighting a war on terrorism, as that's just a form of warfare, and it's like you're saying you're fighting a war on war. Terrorism is just an act of violence from a group. If Osama was the leader of a nation, it would just be called war. And though his acts are terrible, there's nothing to say that Osama is insane, or any evidence that he had been personally slighted by the West. We have to conclude that he actually believes what he is saying. And like the polls mentioned earlier, there are plenty of sane, normal people who have ridiculous, superstitious beliefs. He just happens to take all of his seriously. He explains that these extremist groups play off the concept of shame from the fact that they were the chosen people of God, who are living righteously, but who don't have any of the successes of the godless West. Osama never called for a global redistribution of wealth. Even things like wanting Palestine seems like an afterthought. He quotes him as saying, "I didn't want revenge for anything, I just wanted to be a martyr." He had no grievances, he just wanted to gain rewards from the Muslim faith. For his acts in fighting unbelievers, he could pick 70 family members to bring with him into heaven. What's hard for many people to understand is that terrorism is logically deduced from the Quran. Chapter 9, verse 73 and verse 123 say, "Make war on the unbeliever, hell is their home." The power and success of the West is like a giant empire based on satanic ideas, which might eventually corrupt your children, and because you realize that the spread of capitalism and Western ideas is a necessary part of Western ideology, it is logical that you will choose to fight it. Without an idea for jihad that comes from the Quran, how would you get these suicidal acts and the jubilation that is seen in their community? Chapter 4, verse 95 through 101 gives some insight with lines like, "He that dies in fighting for God gets more rewards." People that try not to see this logical connection often point out that the Quran is against suicide, but it only says do not destroy yourself, but it also says that to die for Islam is what those with the most faith do. Chapter 4, verse 74 through 78 combine this with the fact that Islam doesn't separate from government rule, and it makes sense that you would have to conquer the world. You get to skip the millennia in the earth waiting to be judged by angels, and go straight to Allah's gardens. The only way to stop these ideologies is to stand up to the religious claims themselves. Don't tell the extremists to think about that one line that might be against suicide, but attack the dozens of lines that call for war on the friends of Satan, and ask for evidence for why they believe this is the word of God, And what proof do they have of rewards in the afterlife? Harris points out that people who say that they know the book is true because the book says it's true is the epistemological black hole that is draining the light from this world. He says, imagine if millions of our descendants were dying for our belief in Star Wars or the superiority of the Windows 98 operating system, believing that these things were divinely created. Religious stories are just the media being produced in ancient times, and this is what we are dying over. We got into this bad logical habit because of our fear of death. It seems so incomprehensible to think about being dead. By definition, the only thing we have any experience of is being alive, so the one prediction that is true, that we will die, actually seems unbelievable. The fact that death causes us the most sorrow for others and angst for ourselves, and we can see how people just reject the claim that they can die. This necessary rejection of a simple truth makes it so an actor who reads his Bible will become president over a rocket scientist who doesn't. Other methods of escaping this fear can be through meditation or drugs, and are called mystical, in that they are rare, insignificant, and because they actually tell us something about reality. He admits that the Western religions have gone wrong in this area, and he actually entertains the idea of psychics, though admits we should stick to the idea that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But we are always subjectively interacting with the world around us through our senses. Because our sensory input goes through so many synapses, there are tons of opportunity to contaminate this signal, mixing it up with other information in our brain. So we have religion, meditation, and drugs that all claim that we can tune our brains differently to have these mystical experiences, perhaps giving us an insight to the true nature of reality. But we also have psychotic people, and because of that fact, we can't take all mystical encounters as true. But Sam Harris also says that we cannot abide by reason alone. Here he sets up the point that meditation and drugs may be the cure for religion. This book will be about reconciling the fact that spiritual experiences should be taken seriously, and that our current major religions will kill us, or at least always be incompatible with progressive society. As a man believes, so will he act. Even spiritual experiences are close to universal. People come up with most of the same ethics, and science is not exclusive to anyone. But the specific cultural ideas that start to emerge from religions become so diverse that some of them truly shouldn't be tolerated, as we would never tolerate this diversity in scientific conclusions. Most religions are against stealing or killing people, but then they differ on how they define innocence, and might decree that you should be killed for being homosexual, or for not believing in the right God. Whereas some from our ancient history might have believed in things like human sacrifice. And these are truly ideas that we should not accept, just as we would never accept a doctor that doesn't believe in germ theory. To support his point that people's ideas do cause them to act, he brings up the Nigerian riots over a Miss World pageant that took the lives of over 200 people, most butchered by machetes and burnt alive in order to stop a display of women in bikinis. And the religious police at Mecca prevented firefighters from entering a building because the women didn't have their hijab on. 14 girls burned to death, and 50 were injured. Both of these events were directly linked to specific ideologies in the religious system, and with the incident in Mecca, you couldn't see that happening if it wasn't for that specific clothing decree, which is so revered because it's decided to be a commandment from God. And it's an example of what Sam Harris believes you don't develop from the more universal mystical experiences. That specific incident applies to Islam, but it's a major issue to Jewish and Christian faith as well. As many US presidents have often cited that God was behind them, but you might as well just swap their name out for Zeus or Apollo when they're making speeches, because both were belief systems without evidence. But even with that Greek example, Harris points out that even in ancient Greece, they were starting to become atheistic towards their Olympians, and yet we still have pastors that are trying to combine Genesis with science and push that idea in public schools. We have to keep critiquing religion so that a breakthrough can happen. Just as we are morally shocked and confused by how otherwise normal people supported slavery, our descendants should be shocked at our intellectual shortcomings concerning religion. And it has to happen soon, because as our tech and weapons increase, you will have even more power available to misuse. Harris says, while it has never been difficult to meet your maker, in 50 years, it will be too easy to drag everyone along with you. That's the cost of maintaining these religions that leave open these logical paths to violence, and we should recognize that those defending it are just playing word games. You don't have the right to believe what you want to. Obviously, legally you do, but intellectually or honestly, we do not have the right to believe whatever we want. We don't get to decide on history or physics, and we aren't free to mean whatever we decide to when we say poison, north, or zero. We recognize that these terms all have objective meanings, and need to if we're going to cooperate in a society, and we should be seriously concerned about those who are trying to redefine objective terms. Just as movement is necessary for making truth claims, if you are an organism that is passive to its environment, then there are no actions to take. Reason and logic are required neurologically because we need the same pattern of neurons to fire for the same things. In order to navigate the world, my perception of the world around me has to be relatively the same every time I perceive it. In order to know it's you, I need to hear you and see you mostly the same every time. What people do is linguistic trickery by saying I believe, but then change the requirement for the word believe. We often use the word know, like I believe. I believe that water is 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen, but really I'm saying I know that based on reliable data. When a religious person says I believe, they're just doing it from faith. We don't allow normal people to just say they believe something unfounded, even if it makes them feel good. Like I believe I have a refrigerator-sized diamond in my backyard. Normal claims have to be based in the real world, evidence-based, and are therefore subject to new evidence. Religious claims believe that they describe a state of the way the world is, but they do not take any state of the world into account, and therefore should not be said to be describing any state of reality at all. Harris asks, how is that any different from the claims of a schizophrenic? This is precisely how ignorance ends up getting enshrined. Blessed are those who have seen but not know. John 20 verse 29. Particularly annoying, since many Christians love trying to use facts to find Noah, or date the Shroud of Turin. The only difference between crazy claims and religious claims is the amount of people that believe it. But this leads into another issue, that people think that all ideas are equal, and all authority figures are the same. Religion and science, the Pope and an expert, are all just expressing ideas, and who's to say who really knows how the world works? This is made worse because science admits that there are things that it doesn't know, and it is constantly updating its theories. Also, it never proves a theory true, it just disproves previous theories. Heliocentrism keeps not being disproven, so we still believe in it. But it is possible that a devil is tricking us every single instance we try to measure something. They don't get that we never believe things without some evidence, and this same logic could be applied to other religions, or leprechauns, or really anything, but people just use it to confirm religious ideas that they've already settled on. A scientist would point to evidence that is replicatable and confirmed by other scientists, and thus works like a belief that the sun exists. All of us can keep checking, looking up in the sky, and seeing the sun, and we don't change that belief because a schizophrenic looks up in the sky and sees a demon. His claim is proof of his subjective experience, whereas the vast amount of data collected from those who just look and see the sun is the closest thing we can come to saying that it exists. The Pope might say something, and there is not this function of his claims being replicatable or confirmed by other objective means, and so you can't prove or disprove it either way. Even things like a belief in the Virgin Mary is something that literally cannot be proven by anyone. And it's not like belief is the factor that makes believers better people, as there were Catholics in Mexico that believed so intensely that you had to be baptized in order to get into heaven, that they made sure that when they destroyed native populations, they baptized the infants before bashing their brains out. And even models that appear to be secular, like communism in the Soviet Union and China, they still revolved around a religion of the state, which had illogical and non-evidence-based claims, as there are instances where they changed facts in their textbooks, choosing not to teach Darwin's theories of evolution, because it didn't hold that people were equal, and they feared that it would lead to survival of the fittest, something that seemed a lot like capitalism. Same thing with the Nazis, where they did not have enough evidence to support their claims that the Jews or any of the other races that they wanted to abolish were the causes of any of the problems that they claimed, or that they were biologically inferior in any kind of objective way. Like religion, both Nazism and communism came up with their belief first, and then just ignored any conflicting facts in order to support their ideology. But this belief without evidence takes its precedent from our religious traditions. The Inquisition, for example, comes straight from Deuteronomy. The reason why this is to blame on the New Testament is because it again teaches people to believe claims without evidence. Burning people alive is such an inconsequential thing when you believe that what this sinner has done has already sentenced him to be burned alive for eternity. So at least this way, with this public display, hopefully you get to save your community. In both the European and American witch trials, all it took is for these accusations to turn towards important people for them to start thinking about evidence. Jews so frequently became targets to others because it was more difficult for outsiders to be accepted. You could convert to Christianity or Islam, and both of them recognized the Jewish tradition. Islam even considers Hindus to be people of the book, and recognize Christ as a prophet, but it is impossible to become an actual member of the tribe of Israel. This unique exclusivity, combined with being blamed for the death of Jesus, has created animosity towards the Jews for thousands of years. Within this religious framework which doesn't need evidence, you can see why people believe that they're doing the right thing when they commit acts of violence. Even Augustine admits that he was converted by a belief in miracles, even though stuff like the virgin birth was only brought up later, and seems like it came from a mistranslation of the same miracles that were done by the earlier prophets of Greeks and Jews. If you can perform a miracle, then that is the extraordinary evidence that proves your extraordinary claim correct. The problem is, when this is a historical figure, you can't disprove that it happened, and so now any extraordinary claim may be real, since you've set that precedent. So you have this large group of people with animosity towards each other that don't call for objective evidence, and you wonder how rumors like Jews were torturing Christians, eating their body like it was the wafer of Christ, and drinking their blood like wine, a myth that resulted in the death of at least 3,000 Jews in Europe. Later, Nazis like Himmler would have all sorts of religious thoughts, like the Aryans came down from the sky and were stored away in ice. He believed in telepathy and wanted to mirror the myths of King Arthur. Many German churches helped the Nazis, and the hatred of Jews was just a normal continuation inside of the faith. They were even known to hold on to Jewish wealth and provide ancestry records to the Nazis. To bring it back to his point that beliefs cause actions, a Jainism and a Muslim both believe things that they can't prove, but the Jainists' beliefs will never kill people. Islam has lines in the Quran and Hadith that make it clear that dying for Islam is the best thing you can do, nothing to contradict with that. The only gray area is over what you can kill, where you attack, should you kill kids and old ladies. It all depends on if you can claim it's self-defense. The book claims that killing bad people is for sure good, but the believer is left to figure out who exactly the bad people are. The extremist can easily paint Israel or the West as aggressors, and evil in the big picture. But also towards other Muslims, there is no ambiguity on apostates. Like we saw with Judaism, those who wish to leave the faith are supposed to be killed in no ambiguous terms, and even though Islam claims that there is no compulsion, Harris says that this is just silly. It only applies to Jews and Christians, and Jews were treated terribly under Muslim rule. Here is a list of just some of the murders of Jews across Muslim countries. The Yellow Badge started in Baghdad. Kids were urged to spit on Jews and throw rocks at them. They had to pay a higher tax, and Jews were not allowed to own weapons. They were far less than second-class citizens, and it's a bit misleading to act like that culture isn't trying to force you to convert. Apologists always say most Muslims in the West are tolerant, but don't mistake weakness for liberalism. It isn't just that they are tolerant, it may be that they have no power to overthrow the system yet. Harris's claims here has nothing to do about Arab Muslims, or the moderate Muslims who don't honestly uphold the faith. As he points out, even Cat Stevens, born in the West, agrees with something as extreme as the fatwa on Salman Rushdie, being okay with this guy being killed, just because he critiqued Islam. Many want to claim that this kind of terrorism has nothing to do with Islam, but is a grievance with imperialism. But if that's true, then why does China, India, South America, and many parts of Africa join the global market and adopt liberal Western ideas, while the Middle East and many African countries with Islam produce so many of those who are willing to resort to violence and live in this paradigm of Islam versus the West? It can't be about poverty or exploitation, as those parts of the world just named were treated just as bad, if not much worse, than much of the Middle East. Perhaps it honestly has to do with the fact that people from these regions genuinely believe in these verses about how God hates non-believers. The best Pew results on this give the opinion on suicide bombings on civilians. but they skewed the results by bunching rarely okay with never okay to make it look like more are pacifists. If you ask the question, is it ever justifiable, these countries have a great majority yes. This concept that suicide bombing is acceptable, in any form, is not something that you see in any of these other economically depressed places that have a history of suffering from imperialism. So how can you claim that this is the result of actions from the West, instead of thinking that this is generated from inside the faith? Harris transitions to make a funny point here, that you can tell when this book was written, and when you look at all the stuff that suicidal murderers get, it's all the nice stuff that the wealthy people of the time had. You get all kinds of great food and palaces. It'd be like if a new religion said that in the afterlife, everyone has mansions, masseuses, chefs, and luxury cars, and it just shows a lack of imagination. But ironically, their extreme materialism, as they are rewarded with the material things that they couldn't get on Earth. To prove that many of these countries really do see Islam versus the West as the main paradigm, he points out that many Muslims hated Saddam, but they rallied behind him when he was invaded by the infidel US. It's like a big family that first cares about themselves over any outsiders, even if Saddam was responsible for the genocide of his people. To show some of the disconnect from the intellectual community and the economic community, Sam Harris compares the Islamic countries to Spain. Spain has a greater GDP than all the Arabic countries combined. Spain translates more books into Spanish each year than the entire Arabic world has translated into Arabic since the 19th century. This is more proof of their decision to remain isolated. Hezbollah members are more likely to come from wealthy families and have secondary education than the non-militant Palestinians. Many Hamas leaders have college degrees and master's degrees, and Osama bin Laden is a pinnacle of this point. So we can't say if only they could be better off, wealthier, more educated, live a more comfy life, etc. This will still not stop the religious violence when people believe that they know God's will and that he wants them to kill Satanists. Harris points out that Paul Berman noticed totalitarianism, French philosophers didn't think Nazism was a big deal, and similarly liberalism is in denial and blames warmongering on the government and defense industry. It's a trend of liberalism as denial, blaming warmongering on governments and defense industries. Same happens with the US thinking that it's our fault because of all the bad stuff we do around the world, and that the Israelites are to blame for Palestinian violence. People think excessive rage must be in response to excessive violence. Paul Berman thinks that this is liberalism's bad side, that it won't be stern enough to declare that something is wrong, even when that thing's ideas are fundamentally anti-liberal. Where Harris disagrees with Berman is that he doesn't see this threat similar to the other nihilistic tyrants, because Islam incorporates mysticism that tells its fighters that they will get paradise in the afterlife. It's not nihilistic. They could blow the world apart down to the atoms, and it would still be because of intense meaning. The only way to get to this level of violence, turning yourself into a bomb, sending your kid forward into a line of fire during the Iran-Iraq war, is only possible if you have a strong belief in rewards in the afterlife. Harris wonders if the reason why we are not at full-out war with Muslim countries is just because they are so much weaker than many of the Western powers. And he points out that most of the violence from the New Testament mostly comes from Revelations, which is so full of symbolism that it is harder to take literal, and it's so confusing that it's easily ignored for other more coherent images of Jesus found in Matthew and the Sermon on the Mount. Then Harris points out something said by Beauregard when he claims that on a subconscious level, the US secretly wanted 9/11 to happen, and that we are now only fighting terror with more terror. Harris wonders what Beauregard would think about living under Taliban rule, where there is no music, death squads, and in other countries where adulterers are killed during the halftime of soccer games. How is all of that the fault of the US? Noam Chomsky's 9/11 book reminds people that the US is a major terrorist country, with sanctions on Iraq killing 500,000 children, and the bombing of a Sudanese pharmaceutical company. Harris wonders why he didn't include the Native Americans, slavery, the bombings in Cambodia, the Pentagon Papers, and our lack of banning landmines. These would also help Chomsky's point. But what Chomsky doesn't do is ask why we did these things that he brings up. The Al-Shifa plant was destroyed because Al-Qaeda was using it to try and make chemical weapons. Was it our goal to kill as many Sudanese as possible? Was it motivated because the US feels that Sudanese are the agents of Satan? Did we even intend to kill one Sudanese? if these rockets were sent in the middle of the night, when the plant wasn't even supposed to be open? Think about how different all of those answers would be to the 9/11 attackers. So what Chomsky is really saying is that we did things that had the effect of killing people. Well, why is that any worse than not giving aid? We know full well that children die all over the world due to poverty, so why don't we just provide for ourselves at the bare minimum so that we can save the highest number of people around the world that is possible? To prove the difference between someone like Bush and Osama and Hitler, we can do a thought experiment called the perfect weapon. Bush's perfect weapon would have killed Saddam, maybe all of his military leaders and or his soldiers, but what would Saddam's perfect weapon do to the Kurds or to the citizens that critiqued him? And Osama's would just kill all the non-believers and even imperfect Muslims. We admit this of our own past. We think slavery was barbaric. We think that the massacres in Vietnam were appalling, the kind that were similar to those mentioned earlier with the terrorist attacks in Pakistan. But the difference is that we are shamed by this. We are puzzled, shocked, and horrified that these men could become monsters. And in the case of Vietnam, there are cases of troops that stopped it by saying that they were going to shoot their fellow troops if they went ahead and continued the massacre. We have to be able to admit that some ideas are simply better. Think about child rearing or proper nutritional diets. It is just a fact that considering the wide array of options, there are fewer right answers in life. There is not one right way to raise a kid, or one perfect way to eat, but there are clearly bad ways to do both. Our society is simply more morally and politically advanced than what you see in most Muslim countries. It is not racist, there's no biological basis for this, it all just points to the iteration of maladaptive ideas. Noam doesn't understand that we can say that 9/11 and innocents killed in US bombings are both tragedies, but there is a clear moral difference between intentionally killing children in order to eliminate the religious enemies, what we call terrorism, and accidentally killing kids to eliminate that child-killing terrorist. One could say that even if there is a chance that an action might kill an innocent child, then we shouldn't do it. But the toy industry, roller coasters, cars, all know that they will kill some kids eventually, but that obviously isn't their intention. Fareed Zakaria thinks that it's a wealth issue, made worse from the fact that these countries can get wealth out of the ground without needing to advance their economies overall. They don't need to collect taxes or do anything for their people. He blames politics. Maybe we will just lose some more crops to insects. He thinks the proof that there are tons of fine Muslims proves that there is no need for Islamic reform. But interestingly, he does agree that perhaps they won't embrace a democracy, and maybe they need to be behind a dictatorship. Turning his critique back to religion in general, he talks about how an estimate was made that showed that in the United States, 5 minutes of phones down. That showed that with 5 minutes of the phones being down across the U.S. would be measured in a loss of billions of dollars. And he asks how much time and energy is lost to an invisible God. There are millions of people across the world who are born in countries with corrupt governments or intensely oppressive cultures. And Harris says that the only way to stop something like this would be a strong UN, a sort of world government that could prevent things like the US versus China, and could have the power of rescuing hostages from dictatorships across the world. A technological goal has to be finding a way to make non-weaponizable nuclear energy. We have to try the best we can to have a collective effort to bring countries from around the world out of these archaic ways of thinking, joining a more global economy, and working to get religion out of all of these countries' governments, including the United States. Harris absolutely hated the move by Reagan to include Jerry Falwell in the foreign affairs meetings that went over Middle East briefings. He believed that conflicts in this region were part of a Christian prophecy, something that goes back to the foundations of Israel. It's already bad enough that so many Christians are so hopefully awaiting the billions of death in the war that must occur in order to induce Judgment Day. Roy Moore put a 10 Commandment statue up to address the fact that Alabama had the 6th largest murder rate in the US. Harris asks if they would like to list the death penalty that is also prescribed for these crimes in marble outside of the courthouse. Lieutenant General Boykin claims that he can see Satan's forces in certain shadows and pictures of Mogadishu, and that God revealed them as his enemy. Tom DeLay said that Columbine was due to teaching evolution in school. Justice Scalia believes that we get our morals from God. And there is a correlation that the more Christian a country is, the more they will accept capital punishment. He holds that the death penalty should be applied even to those with severe autism, and comes from a tradition that has sodomy punishable by death, a law that could be specifically applied to homosexuals. There is always a tension in society between private behavior and choice, and how it affects others. Stuff from noise levels to chemical waste is regulated, and some things that are private are outright illegal. Some of this is logical if it is likely to bleed into public life, but the problem is that our laws against vice often come from the idea that they offend God. There is no sense of a private life with the concept of God, and if you believe he judges a whole society, you believe he judges what individuals do, even if it never directly affects others in society. When you look at drugs that are banned like hallucinogenics, it seems like the only reason for this would be to keep a monopoly on spiritualism. Aspirin sends 76,000 people to the hospital each year, while there is no lethal dose of weed. Harris says that because we are a people of faith, taught to concern ourselves with the sinfulness of our neighbors, we have grown tolerant of irrational uses of government's power. These religious-based laws cost something like $100 billion when you account the federal, state, and local tax dollars combined with the lack of revenue. Imagine how future generations would look at us when $2 billion could be spent to completely protect all ports from nuclear bomb smuggling, but we only spend $93 million. We go into Afghanistan, and instead of building up their economy with this money, we make it so that many rural people will see that growing opium may be one of the surest ways to make money in order to provide for their family. Drugs and profits that will be capitalized by terrorist groups, which then sell it to the US while also attacking the US. Laws against stem cell research are also only religious-based arguments. It would only require a few day-old collection of 100 cells, and some are even against the killing of zygotes. But we would literally do more harm in killing a fly. And the potential argument is silly, considering we could just clone cells on your body to create even more life, and so by their logic, we should be creating as much life as possible if the potential is really what they're concerned with. And though Harris disagrees with almost every evangelical point, he also says that there is a ton of hypocrisy in liberals that can see how backwards Christian thinking is, but respect cultural diversity that oppresses and calls for violence. If all traditions and cultures are equal, then the burning of cats for fun in Paris is something that is impossible to critique if we want to respect all viewpoints. We can make rational claims about right and wrong once we recognize that these statements mean happiness versus suffering. If we can reduce suffering and increase happiness, then we can call it good. We no more get the concept that cruelty is wrong from the Bible than we get the concept that 2 + 2 = 4 from a textbook. Even animals can show tons of empathy. It's just that a complete scientific understanding of ethics is unknown, as is the understanding of consciousness, and how to study our minds has changed over hundreds of thousands of years. We need to understand consciousness more, as stuff like an otherwise nice Nazi father can only be explained by him not seeing the suffering of the Jews as more bad than how the Germans and his family were suffering from the Jews. Rocks are not on this list, and it isn't just from pain, as a rabbit would clearly experience pain, but them being burned alive is less horrifying than humans being burned alive. But it isn't based in human DNA either, since that would make a skin cell murderer way worse than killing a wild herd of elephants. Is it based off of language? It can't be because humans lose that ability, or some never had it with aphasia, and there are some animals that can learn sign language. So again, morality must stem from causing the least amount of suffering, while trying to increase the amount of happiness. The burning rabbit is less suffering than the burning human, because the human has a greater understanding of what they are losing, and self-awareness of what they are being deprived. This is how we can have a rational ethics. Some forms of liberalism believes that no one is really right or wrong, that there are cultural differences, but cultural relativism and moral relativism are nonsense. Just apply this to Nazis, we can say that it is objectively wrong because it creates pain and suffering for people. And Nazis also made factual claims about reality that were provably false. Relativism would also have to say that people who believe that their ideas are superior and should be enforced on others should also be respected. Also, pragmatists don't believe that what they believe corresponds with reality. They just focus on utility. This allows someone to hold mutually exclusive beliefs. Syed Khatun, Osama's favorite philosopher, said pragmatism would remove the US's ability to defend itself. Just be realist, as it admits that there are objective truths that all people can find. Pragmatism is also making a realistic claim, that we can't truly know something. But isn't this a claim that must objectively be true or false? This philosophical line of thinking is the ethical equivalent of believing claims without any evidence. Saying that we can never agree on every ethical fact is like saying that all physicists don't agree on everything, but that doesn't mean that there are not objective discoveries about the physical world. Rationalism and evidence-based reasoning is actually intuitive. We don't feel the need to explain 2 plus 2, and we can demonstrate it. And people in their original state usually think like this. They almost always think like this if there isn't any bias already injected. So it is normal to go with our ethical intuition. We should only say that we believe things from study and experiments. And reason should always stem from these things, and will be applicable to the real world, so therefore it has to represent some part of reality, whereas the mystic is saying you should believe it because I said so, and the relativist is saying you should believe it because many people say so. From here we transition to where Sam Harris examines his own beliefs on torture, and how himself, and many of us, are actually being very illogical. Why is it worse to torture someone who you have great reason, or know for sure to have information that can save innocent lives, if we are okay with police or militaries that we know will kill or maim innocent people? When we drop bombs, we accept the fact that we will torture some innocent people, children even, yet we disdain some of the things that happen at Guantanamo Bay, yet there are no children at Guantanamo. Just because it doesn't feel as bad when you press a button and drop a bomb, this act may have slowly crushed a child to death, burned someone alive, caused them to lose limbs or eyes, and give them lifelong chronic pain conditions. But for some reason, us torturing someone who is known and who is an admitted terrorist is still something that we find appalling. Harris admits that he was originally against torture, and when he wrote this part of the book, he thought about how it made us more civilized, but the more he reviewed it, he found that it didn't make any sense. It doesn't contradict with his point against Noam Chomsky calling us terrorists. It doesn't contradict with his point against Noam Chomsky calling us terrorists because we drop bombs. We still are only doing it to save lives greater than the amounts of lives killed, and because we are reacting to terrorists. We never intend to kill kids, whereas a terrorist intentionally sets out to kill as many people as possible. Harris then critiques pacifism, and brings up things like how Gandhi thought that the Jews should have committed suicide in order to raise awareness of what the Nazis were doing. Problem is that when your enemy has no scruples, your scruples become another weapon in your enemy's hand. Pacifism is the only way to guarantee that no innocent lives are lost, but it is not tenable. But history has proven that it is not tenable, and actually immoral to let evil people rob others of their lives, when you can just make that murderer live according to what they are okay with, and murder them first. Again, we do not fully understand how consciousness works, and the tools of science may not be good enough to determine how matter becomes a thinking thing. All of metaphysics is an absolute mystery, that there is something instead of nothing, and our knowledge of the brain tells us nothing of the metaphysical conscious mind, and as our experience as brains is never broken, we cannot get out of our own senses while still retaining consciousness. There are Buddhist views that more accurately align with our modern concepts of consciousness that come from philosophers that were contemporaries of Muhammad. And that's not even counting the fact that the tradition was already 1,000 years old at that time. These meditators realized that the way to recognize our existence is that of the self as an illusion, really just a series of thoughts back to back, that most people in the West called I, whereas neuroscience and a lot of traditions in the East closer align with this idea of no self. In summary, Harris believes that religious ideas set the precedent for having beliefs that are not based in evidence. We are at our worst when we don't ask for evidence, and what people believe does have an impact on what they do. Many parts of the world are impoverished, suffered from imperialism, but because they don't have this tradition of Islam, they don't support suicide bombing, or the forms of terrorist attacks that are disproportionately plaguing the world. Cultural relativism is self-contradictory, as it would have to accept some cultures' beliefs that other cultures are inferior. Throughout history, these claims without evidence, religiously motivated, have resulted in the deaths of countless people, and people who truly believe in the Bible or the Quran have to be against certain forms of scientific progress, as it is logically deduced from their books. This is not an attack on religious people, but Harris believes that we need to be able to critique bad ideas, and be honest about their real-world effects, and how the potential for disaster only increases over the years, as our technology gets more powerful, and you could have things like nuclear bombs falling into the hands of extremists. He believes that we can have rational ethics, finding objective ways to reduce the amount of suffering and increase the amount of happiness, while still interacting with our mysterious metaphysical existence through the use of things like drugs and meditation. Traditions that do these are not only closer to the findings of actual neuroscience, but they achieve some of the universal ethical understandings shared by most cultures across the world, without the dogmatic, ironically secular perversions of metaphysical ideas that start critiquing how you dress, what genders can do what with what pieces of flesh, and what physical-based rewards you get in the afterlife. Harris believes that the psychologically healthy future of society will be to grow out of most of these religious traditions, but that we can still find spiritual fulfillment through these other means. Now this part is a bit of a bonus, but because this book is being reviewed so far after its release, there was an edition where he addresses some of his critics. Some point out that crimes were committed by atheists like Hitler and Stalin, but he said that these regimes enshrined the idea that you cannot be critical of them, and that they were still dogmatic, not free and open to ideas or critiques. Neither of these two men based their ideas on evidence, and he challenges these critics to find any people on Earth that have suffered because they became too reasonable or rational. Some say that everybody has to have faith. You have faith that you're going to wake up the next morning, that the world isn't going to explode this next second. But Harris points out that this is just silly. Even strict skeptics like David Hume say that we do have to assume that we're in touch with reality, and this everyday sort of faith is clearly not the same kind of word used by religious people. As I have the evidence that every time I went to sleep I woke up, every second before the Earth did not explode, I'm not aware of any factors that are about to make the world explode, so I have no reason to believe that will happen. Whereas when religious people say that they have faith in their religion, they start claiming that they do know how the creator of the universe wants us to live. They start giving specifics that cannot be based in evidence, like the many restrictions on who you should have sex with, or how you should dress, just to name a few. The casual kind of optimism that we have every day is not the same thing as the faith that would lead to the hatred of gays, or the slaughtering of infidels, as our everyday faith is a kind of adaptation, something that allows us to fall asleep on an airplane, but never something that would motivate you to crash that airplane into a building to kill unbelievers. Also, he fully admits that the world could explode in the next second, that he might die in his sleep, but when somebody says they have faith in religion, they will never admit that the word faith does imply uncertainty. He also addresses the idea that Islam is no more violent than the other religions, or that they are only acting out of socio-economic conditions, and so we ask the question, where are all the Palestinian Christian suicide bombers, who also suffered through the indignities of Israeli rule, and where are all the Tibetan Buddhist suicide bombers under Chinese rule? Even if you want to talk about how different versions of Buddhism may have been used to make kamikaze pilots in Japan, they have to go through so much work to try and find ways to use that to defend nationalism, which makes no sense in Buddhist teaching. There's nothing in Buddhism that glorifies dying for the empire, and yet there are so many parts in Islam that glorify dying for the faith. And very interestingly, a bunch of atheists were upset with the book too, because they thought he was trying to sneak in Buddhist teachings and a form of New Age mysticism. I mentioned towards the beginning that he actually entertains the ideas of psychics, as there are some very interesting anecdotes, and I saw that as him trying to be honest about the limitations of our understanding of metaphysics, as we really don't know if psychic phenomena is possible or not. But he immediately reminds us that we can't just say we believe it, and extraordinary claims still require extraordinary evidence. The point of bringing that up, and the many findings from those going under deep meditation, something that primarily comes from Hindu and Buddhist traditions, is to point out that our understanding of consciousness is not complete, and that all religions are claiming to engage with the metaphysical, but some, like Buddhism, though they also make unprovable claims about reality, like reincarnation, that you can't really prove or disprove. So they make those bad, non-evidence-based claims just like other religions, But we can take from that tradition the idea of meditation, since objective scientific studies do show that it has an effect on the mind and has positive effects on the body. Neuroscience points to the idea that our consciousness is a bit of an illusion, and that meditation and some hallucinogenic drugs do get us into this state of no self. So because this does align with evidence, he finds that these beliefs are actually quite rational. He compares it to an empirical discovery of the optical blind spot that you would have never noticed was there, but you can prove through experimentation that our mind is playing a trick there. Other atheists and materialists have critiqued him, saying that he ends up leaving the door open to God because he highlights that there is still a mystery of how a collection of atoms can become conscious. He says his detractors think that this could just form another type of violent religion, but Harris says there's nothing you can make a religion out of, as that's just a fact, and there's nothing you could really deduce about how to run society based off of that, or how you should judge people's personal lives. And to address those that wonder why even talk about this stuff at all, just let people be, he says that's the exact way people can stay in bad ideas, that as a culture, we have elevated the ideas of authority, superstition, and ignorance. It's taboo to talk about people's politics, religion, or life choices, and yet these are the precise things that could benefit by having an evidence-based, rational conversation. Being able to critique political and religious ideas is crucial to a civilized society, and the worst thing that we can try and do is try and keep it out of public discussion, for fear of giving offense. So that concludes End of Faith by Sam Harris.